When Hollywood star Morgan Freeman appeared on a live talk show, he expected a thoughtful and respectful atmosphere. However, the host took a completely different approach and started asking uncomfortable and inappropriate questions. Instead of losing his cool, Freeman reacted in such a way that the entire audience was left in awe. His calm but eloquent words completely changed the atmosphere in the studio, plunging everyone into silence. This unforgettable moment demonstrated once again why Morgan Freeman is one of the most respected figures in Hollywood. The air in the studio was filled with anticipation. Every seat was taken, and millions of viewers were locked in front of their screens at home. They couldn't wait to see Morgan Freeman's wisdom. It was his first program in a long time, and everyone missed him. He was a legend who made you feel the meaning of life when he spoke. At 86, he was still sharp, confident, and respected. He took the stage with heavy steps and greeted the audience with his deep and familiar voice. The crowd erupted in applause. It was clear that everyone missed him. But as Freeman settled into his seat, something didn't feel right. After all, he had years of experience as a Hollywood star. The host, Vanessa Clark, was known for her bold and often brutal approach. Morgan had done countless interviews, but tonight was going to be very different from the others. Vanessa leaned forward with a slight smile and began to speak in a soft but sharp voice. "Morgan, does someone your age ever wake up thinking, 'Could this be my last day?'" No one expected to start the program with such a question. The host was supposed to be respectful, but he started with disrespect. The hall suddenly fell silent. The smiles on people's faces disappeared. Morgan didn't even blink. He just returned Vanessa's gaze with his hands folded in his lap. A storm was brewing, and Vanessa didn't even realize what she had just ignited. A wave of unease spread through the audience. Some exchanged worried glances. Others fidgeted uncomfortably in their chairs. Vanessa laughed lightly, as if to show that her words were harmless. But Morgan Freeman was still sitting still. His eyes looked at her with a deep, wise, and omniscient expression. But Vanessa was not finished yet. Before the audience could recover from the shock of the first question, they were shaken even more by the second. "You played God," she said, tilting her head to the side. "But let's be realistic. You're just a man, a very old man. How does it feel to know your time is almost up?" He was asking questions as if he wanted to finish Morgan off. He was basically saying, "You're finished, you're gone." And in doing so, he was referring to all the old people. There were gasps echoing through the studio. An elderly woman in the front row put her hand over her heart. Morgan took a deep breath and shook her head slightly. She'd spent decades in Hollywood. She'd seen arrogance, cruelty, and outright disrespect. But this was on a whole other level, and Vanessa seemed to be enjoying it. The camera focused on Morgan's face. It was impossible to read his expression, but it was clear he was thinking something inside. This was no longer just about her. It was for all old people who felt insignificant and worthless. Morgan leaned forward, clasping her hands together. "Mrs. Clark," he said, his voice calm but sharp, "have you ever sat next to someone as they took their last breath?" The question sent a chill through the room. Vanessa blinked. She hadn't expected such an answer. "Well, she stammered, but Morgan interrupted her. "I sat down," he said in a low voice, "many times." The room fell into a heavy silence. Morgan's voice carried the burden of countless memories. "I have held the hands of people I love. I have witnessed them say their last words," he continued. "I've watched extraordinary men and women take their last breaths, but do you know their greatest regret?" Vanessa swallowed. "They don't want more money or more fame," Morgan said. "They wish they had loved more, forgiven more, lived their lives with more meaning." The camera turned to the audience. The whole audience was watching in amazement. Morgan caught Vanessa's gaze, looked deep into her soul. "You ask me how it feels to be old," he said. "Being old is a privilege, and it's a privilege that most people don't get." Suddenly, the audience burst into applause, but Morgan wasn't finished yet, and Vanessa Clark, for the first time in her career, was silent. She clutched her cards tightly in her hand, as if they offered her something to hold on to. The tension in the studio made everyone uncomfortable. The audience was almost holding its breath. Morgan Freeman's words hung in the air, undeniable and unforgettable. "It's an honor to be old, and there are many people who don't have that honor." Vanessa laughed lightly, but her voice was shaking. "Morgan, you really are a master storyteller," she said. Then she paused and continued, "But let's be honest. Hollywood often forgets people your age, doesn't it?" Underlying this sentence was Vanessa's rejection in Hollywood. She had recently tried to make the transition from TV presenter to movie actress, but unfortunately, she had never been accepted. When she saw a Hollywood legend like Morgan in front of her, she wanted to take it out on him. Morgan exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. He rubbed his fingers, a familiar gesture when he was deep in thought. He turned his gaze to Vanessa, not angrily, not offended, but with a softer expression, with pity. "Dear Vanessa, let me tell you a story." The audience leaned forward. Morgan Freeman was going to speak, and everyone was going to listen. Because Morgan Freeman speaks, you listen. "Once upon a time there was a young man," he began, his voice full of emotion. He was full of dreams, full of life. He believed there would always be a place for him in the world. But time is a master at humbling you. One day the young man grew old and realized that the world that once applauded him no longer did. They no longer saw him, no longer listened to him. "But one night," Morgan continued, "as I sat by my window, I watched a storm coming, and that's when I realized." Vanessa was trying to figure out where this conversation was going. It was as if things were getting out of control. "I realized that even when the sky darkened, even when the earth forgot about the moon was still there, still burning, still shining, even if it was behind the clouds." Morgan's eyes softened, and he looked at Vanessa. "My dear friend," she said gently, "being insignificant is a label the world puts on old people, but wisdom is never lost." Vanessa's lips parted slightly, as if she was trying to say something, but for the first time in her career, she couldn't find the words. The camera panned to the audience. A young woman held her grandmother's hand tightly. People weren't just watching, they were feeling. Vanessa fidgeted in her chair, cleared her throat. "That was a moving speech, Morgan." Morgan smiled slightly. "It wasn't a speech, Vanessa. It was real." After taking a deep breath, Vanessa smiled. "Let's change the subject, shall we?" She flipped through her cards. "Let's talk about your childhood," he said. "Your mother was a cleaning lady and your father left when you were a little boy. Tell me, Morgan, did you ever resent that your father left you when you were young?" The audience tensed. It was a tough question, but Morgan just smiled, because he knew what he was going to say, and when he spoke, the world would remember it forever. Morgan Freeman stood still, his eyes deep and thoughtful. 86 years of wisdom were hidden in his silence. Vanessa grinned confidently, thinking she had finally cornered him, but Morgan, he just smiled, and she spoke in that legendary voice. "Yeah, my dad left. My mom worked as a cleaning lady, but do I resent that? No, Vanessa, I thank them." Morgan's voice was calm, but full of unquestionable power. "My father taught me something important. He showed me what kind of man I should be. And my mom," his eyes flashed with emotion, "she taught me how to survive." Vanessa blinked. She hadn't expected such a response. Morgan leaned forward, locking eyes with Vanessa. "You see, Vanessa, pain is a teacher, and it taught me a good lesson." Once again, Morgan Freeman had turned pain into wisdom. Vanessa leaned back in the chair as if uncomfortable. The energy in the room had completely changed. Morgan Freeman sat across from her, a man who had tasted pain, faced loss, and done the impossible. He was never a victim. He has always been a fighter. "You asked me if I regret my past," he said softly. The truth is, I carry it with me every day, but never as a burden. His deep voice echoed in the hall. I carry it as a reminder, because I am still here. An old man in the front row bowed his head. A woman whispered, "God, that was beautiful." Morgan sighed, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. "You know what the world's problem is today, Vanessa?" he said calmly. "Too many people look at their past and feel anger, but when I look at my past, I feel gratitude." The audience erupted in applause. Vanessa bit her lip. She realized she was losing control. She hadn't expected this. She certainly wasn't prepared for what Morgan was about to say. She took a sharp breath. Her plan was to put Morgan Freeman on the spot, to back him into a corner. But the tables had turned. Now it was he who felt shaken. He straightened his shoulders, tried to regain his confidence. "Morgan," he said, a forced confidence in his voice, "do you ever get scared? After all, you're 86 years old. You've had an incredible career, but time stops for no one." Again it was a tough question. Morgan just smiled. Then he leaned in a little, and what he said shook the world. "Vanessa," he murmured, "do you know the difference between fear and faith?" Morgan's voice was warm and sincere. "Fear," she said, "is believing the worst will happen to you. Faith is believing the best will happen." A tear rolled down one woman's face. Something was happening. Morgan continued, "I wake up every morning and choose faith." Vanessa swallowed hard. The power of Morgan's words was undeniable. For the first time in her career, Vanessa Clark lacked words. Morgan Freeman spoke a truth so profound that it pierced the soul. Vanessa looked around, clearly uneasy. She had expected to take control of the conversation, had planned to make it difficult for him to defend her. But instead, Morgan had turned the entire interview into something much bigger than himself. The camera focused on an elderly woman in the front row. Tears streamed down her face. Morgan noticed her and offered a warm smile. "You understand, don't you?" he asked gently. "Yes," the woman whispered, nodding, her hands shaking. Morgan turned to Vanessa. "You see, Vanessa," she said, "wisdom is not about age. It's about perspective. And when you stop fearing the end for even a moment and start embracing life, that's when you really start living." The room exploded with applause. Tears mingled, and for the first time Vanessa was afraid of what was going to happen. She moved in her chair, realizing she was losing control, and she knew it. Her producers were watching her from the control room, probably wondering why she hadn't cut her yet. But there was nothing she could do. This moment belonged to Morgan Freeman. He gave a forced laugh to regain control. "Okay, Morgan," he said, "you've imparted enough wisdom. Now let's talk legacy. What do you say? How will people remember you when you're gone?" With this question, he wanted to probe family ties. Gradually, the questions became more and more despicable. The room fell silent once more. He had asked a harsh and surprising question, but Morgan just smiled. Vanessa?" he said, shaking his head. "You're asking the wrong question." Vanessa frowned. "What do you mean?" Morgan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to almost a whisper. "This isn't about how people will remember me when I'm gone," she said. "The question is, how will people remember you?" Vanessa froze. This was no longer just an interview. This was a showdown, and for the first time in her life, Vanessa Clark felt shrunken. She locked eyes with him. The cameras, the bright lights, the audience, it all disappeared. Morgan's words hit her like a freight train. "How will they remember you?" Vanessa had always been the one to ask the tough questions, to make others uncomfortable. But now, everything was reversed. She parted her lips, but no sound came out. Morgan leaned back, giving her space. His eyes were both gentle and indestructible. "You see, Vanessa," he said, "I've spent my life telling stories, helping people, trying to understand them. And when my time is up, I know I'll leave something meaningful behind." Then Morgan turned to her. "But you," he said, pausing, have a powerful platform, but you use it to tear others down. From the moment the program started, you tried every way you could to corner me, but you couldn't." Vanessa glanced down, clutching her cards tightly like a lifeline. Morgan took a quiet breath and kept his voice softer. "But it's still not too late," she said. "You can choose a different path." A tear rolled down Vanessa's face, and in that moment, worlds watched her. Vanessa sat, shattered. Her fingers were trembling. For the first time in her career, she was completely vulnerable. Morgan Freeman's words didn't just sound good, they went straight to her heart. "The real question is not how people will remember me. The real question is how will they remember you?" The silence in the studio was deathly thick, but in Vanessa's mind, it was chaos. She had built an empire by outsmarting others, by asking the questions no one else dared. But this moment had left her with no answers. Morgan sighed. Then he spoke again. His voice was deep, calm, and determined. "You see, Vanessa," he said, "people think power is based on how loud they can talk, but real power comes from knowing when to listen." Vanessa lowered her eyes to the floor. Her breathing was erratic. For the first time, she was forced to really listen, and it was tearing her apart. The audience was stunned, silent. This was no longer Vanessa Clark. Everyone knew that she had always been the one in control, the one steering the conversation. But now she looked small, vulnerable, human. A single tear fell on her card. Morgan's expression softened. "Vanessa," he said gently, "for years you've asked people difficult questions, but have you ever asked yourself those questions?" Vanessa took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears. For years she had uncovered other people's truths. Now her own truth was being revealed. Morgan leaned in. His voice was warm and patient, like a father speaking to his child. "It's never too late," he said. Vanessa closed her eyes tightly. A deep sob escaped her lips, and in that moment, the world watched Vanessa Clark collapse live on air. Millions of viewers at home, live viewers in the studio, producers behind the scenes, they all saw it. Vanessa Clark, one of television's most powerful interviewers, was crying, not from embarrassment, but because Morgan Freeman had confronted her with herself. The cameras caught his face, raw, vulnerable. She whispered, shaking her head. "I don't know if I like what will be remembered about me." Morgan smiled gently. "Then, my friend," he said softly, "change the story." Suddenly there was applause in the hall. Vanessa Clark sat motionless. Her tears glistened, her hands trembled, her mind raced. The world was watching her transformation. Morgan Freeman had not shamed her. He had not condemned her. He had saved her. She took a deep breath. For the first time in his career, his question was sincere, not pressing. He spoke in a low voice. "Morgan, if you could have one message to share before you leave this world, what would it be?" Morgan paused. He looked first at Vanessa, then at the crowd, then upwards. He paused for a moment, as if he were speaking directly to the sky. Finally, a smile spread across his face. "Love is good," he said gently. "Life is not measured by the years we live, but by the love we give." Vanessa closed her eyes, letting the weight of his words sink deep into her soul. This wasn't just an answer, it had become a truth. For a moment, the studio fell silent. Then a single clap, then another, and another. Suddenly the entire room erupted in applause. Strangers embraced. Some simply stood with their hands over their hearts. Vanessa placed a hand on her chest. "Morgan, you changed my life," she said. Morgan smiled. "No," he said, "you changed it yourself." This was no longer just a talk show. It was an unforgettable moment etched into history. Then Morgan spoke. His voice was thick with emotion. "My friends," he said, "I've lived a long time. I've known pain, I've known loss, but more than all of that, I've known something far more powerful. I've seen love. A wave of emotion swept through the room. Morgan smiled. If you take one thing from tonight, let it be this. Go home. Call someone you love. Forgive someone who holds a grudge against you, and tell the people who matter that they matter. A woman in the front row began to cry. Vanessa covered her mouth to keep from sobbing. Morgan looked at her one last time. You asked me what my legacy would be, he murmured. Love, he said, and with those words, he walked off the stage, leaving behind a moment that would change the world forever. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button. Let us know in the comments which of Morgan's words resonated with you the most. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story. And always remember, life isn't measured by the years we live, but by the love we give.